Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session about inflation. As I was thinking about this session and about the things I wanted to ask about, I remembered something that happened to me. I live in New York, and I was at the grocery store, and as I was checking out, I had this feeling that I've had a lot of times over the last few years, which is when the cashier gave me the total, I thought, there has been a terrible mistake. But I know enough not to say anything at this point. I also know enough not to hold up a line in New York. So I stood outside of the supermarket going through the receipt, trying to figure out why the price was so much higher than I thought it would be. I think versions of this have happened all over the world, obviously to much more serious degrees than mine. Inflation, though, has become a global issue since the pandemic. And more generally than just prices rising, price stability. But luckily, we have a really brilliant panel to help us talk through inflation, where it's headed, and what some of the causes and effects might be. So I will start with Karen Young. She is a political economist and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. She's also a research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. We have Elizabeth Thurbin, a professor of political economy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and director of the Green Energy Statecraft Project. Finally, we have Yiping Huang, Dean of National School of Development at Peking University, an expert on financial services in China, who has also been an economist all over the world, has worked as an economist all over the world. Yiping, I will start with you.
Sure.
With your global knowledge, would you mind talking a little bit about the source of the inflation we've seen? Because this has really been an issue since the pandemic. The reasons behind it have changed: supply chain, labor shortages, now the conflict in the Middle East. But what do you see as the issues that are underlying this and the differences that countries are experiencing?
Well, I guess the general theme globally is that inflation is picking up almost everywhere. But you mentioned about the pandemic, and especially during and immediately after the pandemic, we saw inflation rising in different places. However, if you look at the CPI numbers in most economies,
Consumer Price Index.
At the Consumer Price Index, at the beginning of the year or late last year, they were pretty stable, mild, and that's why people were thinking about either holding their monetary policy unchanged, or some policymakers are thinking about cutting the interest rate. However, things changed after February. So I think that Middle East conflict was probably a trigger of rising inflation rate across the board. During this time, so you see in the US, inflation rate rose to 4.2%, in the Eurozone, 3.2%. Even in China, it's 1.2%. That's actually higher than what we had. But I guess, so that's a common theme, and I think energy was one driver. But there are some different stories. In the US, you mentioned things are becoming more expensive. I suspect that partly because the Fed was a bit slow in fighting against the high inflation in 2021, 2022. So even though inflation rate came down, but I guess absolute level of prices stayed relatively high. But in the US, we're also seeing relatively strong domestic demand, especially this time related to the equipment cost related to the data center and so on. For China, that's a slightly different story. We are also seeing inflation rate picking up. But if you look at the core inflation, excluding energy and so on, it's still 0.6%. You look at the US, China, and the Eurozone, we all had a CPI target at 2%.
Yeah.
But for them, the rate is higher now. So the question is, should we cut and should we cut more? The question, the challenge in China is, it's still below 2%. How do we achieve modest increase in inflation is something I think we should work on.
Yeah, I remember finding that a strange thing when I was first learning economics, that we want to see a little inflation. We want to see prices rising a little bit.
Yes.
And when they're not, that is actually its own set of problems. Karen, I'd love to move to you. Would you mind talking about the energy aspect of this. What have we seen happen with energy prices sort of since the pandemic? It's been quite a ride.
It has been a ride, and it's interesting to compare what's happened since February 28th with our prior kind of energy and political crisis, which meaning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In that period, in 2022, we actually saw a higher price spike, certainly in natural gas, than what we've seen since February 28th. And this, the lesson that we're learning is that, it really sort of depends on where the impact lands. In the latest, 3 months and a half or so, the geographic impact of higher energy prices has been really geographically disparate. So we saw it very heavy first in Asia, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and then slowly, depending on access to refined products, coming to Europe and also to the United States. But where we saw the highest increase in refined fuel gasoline prices, the U.S. was actually top 5 of highest price increase. And some of the disparity in where people feel that inflationary pressure in the things they use that come from oil really depends on how governments have behaved, even in their ability to stockpile fuels and their ability to provide subsidies. So in many developing economies, the wealthier ones were able to have access to some reserves or to provide subsidies to citizens. And in India, for example, we see really high subsidies. And so you don't see the same inflationary pressure, but it reveals itself in a different way in the economy. It essentially shrinks fiscal space for governments, right? So if they're paying out more to reduce the price impact to citizens, that money comes from somewhere, and it limits the government's ability to spend in other places. And so we'll continue to feel that, even as oil prices are going down, right? Because the governments will have to account for what they spent at the beginning of the year. So, I would say in terms of where we are now, oil prices are going down. That's a good thing. We never reached, this was this enormous supply shock to oil and gas in our global markets. Why weren't prices $150, $200 a barrel? It's a question everyone's asking right now. And the reason for that is that we had these strategic reserves, especially here in China, and a reduction in demand, especially in China, right? Mm-hmm. And there's, we're still trying to measure where else has the demand destruction happened and why, to kind of be a lesson for what's been happening in the last few months, because it will probably happen again. So just because we are seeing, lower prices now, the bit of opening into the Strait of Hormuz doesn't mean that volatility is over. So I would say, I would expect that, as we see political tensions, certainly in the Middle East region, but it could be as a result of trade tensions and tariffs, mentioning, prices increasing in the United States on materials, a lot of that is because of the higher price for steel. A lot of the inputs of what's manufactured in the United States has become just more expensive, and we have higher, cost of imported goods. So, there's a lot of reasons. What's happened in the last few months, I think, has taught us that governments have some levers to deal with, particularly in higher prices in energy. But we're probably not out of the woods on that. There's going to be continued volatility. And this experience is teaching governments that they need to insulate, protect themselves, meaning they might be willing to pay more for different kinds, diversification of energy sources from different places. That's going to cost something, right? So the inflationary trend in energy markets, I would say, is going to be with us, even if we have an abundant supply, particularly of oil and gas.
Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you something about the higher energy prices we've seen recently, which is there a positive aspect to it? Is this the kind of thing that inspires people to invest more in alternative energies?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. It really hurts. Higher energy prices really hurt, so it's hard to think about a positive outcome in this short term when we're all feeling that immediate pain. But interestingly, not everyone is feeling the pain of energy price shocks, those countries that have invested heavily in the rollout of renewable energy, which is now by far the cheapest form of energy. Once you've built it, of course, the capital costs are high, but ongoing it is the cheapest form of energy. So countries, in particular China, which has spent years building the world's largest renewable energy system, was quite insulated. And indeed, in my own country, in Australia, we have one of the highest rates of solar panel penetration on homes. So many people don't pay anything for their energy once they've paid off the solar panels. So, but that has led to its own kind of two-track system. It amplifies inequalities in many ways, because you have the people who are able to rely on rooftop solar, typically if they live in their own home. But if you live in an apartment block, it's much more difficult to have access to rooftop solar. Often you don't have that, or if you're in public housing, or if you simply can't afford to put panels on, then you can't take advantage of those cheaper prices. So to come back to your question, yes, I think that the crisis has definitely shown those countries that have been most insulated have sought to, whenever we're reliant on imported fossil fuels, this kind of energy crisis will be a risk. And so we have to find a way to get out of this reactive, we will constantly be reacting to prices beyond our control, or we can take charge of our own energy destiny by manufacturing our own energy security, by investing heavily in renewables.
Yiping, I'd love to ask you about this. You're nodding, so I feel like you have thoughts, but also reactivity is kind of how the economy works, right? Supply, demand, it is like a shifting balance. But is what Elizabeth's saying true, that economies that are able to maybe look past the free flow of markets, do they have an advantage at a moment like now?
Well, I think certainly there is a stronger interest or motivation in developing the alternative energy, the green energy. When you said if there could be some positive effect, I was secretly hoping when this the instability happened, that this might push China out of the low inflation problem we suffer for many years. And the reason was, you probably all heard Japan suffered from deflation or low inflation problem for decades. And suddenly they came out, I'm not sure if you're aware of the timing, immediately after 2022, the Ukraine conflict. And I asked many scholars in Japan, how did they come out? Now inflation rate is 2-3%, more normal for a developed country. They gave me different reasons, and there's no single unified answer why that happened. But one fact they always mention was because of the oil price shock caused by the Ukraine. So I think the issue there was essentially the reason why inflation rate stayed so low. It was not good for economic activity because it caused a vicious cycle of expectations by consumers, producers, and investors. Essentially, it became contractionary. That's why a push on energy price, like you push out, and in fact, the one professor from Tokyo University said he did the surveys, routine surveys of consumers, and he found psychological change before and after 2022. Before that, if you go to a grocery store and you find the price increased, consumers' usual response was they just would put down the goods they're looking at, walk to the shop next door. But now, when that happens, and they will just buy it. So that means psychology of consumers actually changed. And this is something we are hoping to achieve. At the beginning of the year in China, the government usually announced two targets. One is GDP growth target, and the other is inflation rate. Normally what happened was the government was really serious about the growth target. If they say 5%, we have to make every effort to achieve that. But when we announce a CPI rate, normally it's 3%. I don't think people were serious. Like unless it goes to 5% or 6%, then the authorities will take action. When it's below 3%, nobody was like taking serious effort. This year it was different. They said achieving moderate inflation is becoming a hard policy goal. That's something we're going to achieve, but I told you the story might not materialize. We still have to worry about the low inflation problem here.
It is a funny thing because in the US, where I'm from, the worry is so much about rising prices that it seems like an enviable problem. But I know that low inflation can be very difficult.
True.
Karen, I'm curious about your thoughts on like the positive aspects of rising energy prices. Do you see it as potentially kind of a positive thing at this moment when we've got data centers pushing up electricity prices, we've got the war with Iran pushing up gas prices? Is there a positive aspect to that, or do you not see that so much?
I think in the United States and actually many other economies, including across the Middle East, it's a different kind of problem, right? We have persistent inflationary pressure, particularly on fuels, but also on food items. And you know, what drives a lot of, you know, the cost of money and borrowing cost is what is the interest rate in the United States. And right now, despite the president's wishes and pressure, we do not, and probably should not see lowered rates from the Federal Reserve. So as long as we're in an environment where the cost of borrowing is going to be a bit higher, interest rates will be a bit higher, you know, that is going to be harder for growth to happen, for companies to grow. And so we're entering a little bit of a different stage where you're getting like higher inflation, lower growth expectations, and so you get that kind of stagflation problem, which is not great, and particularly for growing regions, emerging markets in the Middle East where I study, that's a big tension point. And we are going to see increasing pressure from energy producers and energy importers. So energy producers are going to be doubling down on resilience, on redundancy, building new pipelines, you know, capex into oil and gas. That ultimately builds, you know, price pressure on those materials and on those inputs. And at the same time, access to capital is not getting cheaper. So that's a longer term, you know, inflationary pressure. And for importers, particularly in the Middle East region, that means that you know, servicing debt is still expensive. It means paying the price for importing fuels is still expensive. That doesn't leave you a lot of room to pay for growth and, you know, in social services or educating people, training them for the workforce. That's not a great scenario. I mean, your question is a little different. You're saying, well, would that incentivize perhaps different kinds of behavior or, you know, investing in renewables? Yes, it can. But again, back to this sort of trade tension policies. It depends on the price of those products. And as long as, you know, countries are having to balance, what do I have at home? Is coal cheaper at home? Then I'm going to choose coal. And so the renewable, you know, play, particularly for governments that have decided to put up barriers to inputs, Chinese solar, for example, that's going to hinder the rollout of those kind of renewable choices.
Elizabeth, before our panel started, you were talking a little bit about thinking maybe this moment might inspire countries to create reserves of kinds. Would you mind describing that and whether you think that actually might be an outcome of this moment?
Yeah, it's something that's really important to think about from a range of different angles, I think. You know, this issue about inflation being such a huge challenge, and what tools do we have to manage it? Well, we generally have central banks, you know, because we know that money is really a foundational infrastructure for the whole economy. The cost of money really determines the cost of building things, of borrowing, you know, et cetera, and your ability to manage inflationary pressures. And so we create central banks to manage the price of money and help us manage these types of inflationary crises. Maybe we should think about energy in the same way. Energy is absolutely foundational to the whole economy. The price of energy determines your manufacturing competitiveness. It determines households' ability to heat and cool in crucial moments. It determines, you know, economic productivity. But we don't have we don't treat it the same way that we treat money. So maybe it would be helpful to think about having an energy reserve bank, for example.
Strategic petroleum reserves.
Yeah, that's true. But I'm thinking more in terms, if we think about the shift to renewable energy and this challenge of we know that renewables, when they're built, they produce very cheap energy, but actually the cost of producing that capital intensive cost is very, very high. And often, your ability to secure cheap finance will impact on the price of energy. We know that for every 1% decrease in the weighted average cost of capital is a 10% decrease in the cost of energy that comes out on the other side of a project. So is there a way to think about using new governmental structures to help drive down that cost of borrowing for renewables? Say, for example, an energy reserve bank could issue off-take contracts for clean energy projects, and that sovereign rating of the government in issuing that contract allows that project to raise very cheap capital. So if you use that government purchasing power, you lower the cost of capital for renewable energy projects, and then the bank could on-sell that energy and on-sell it on terms long, medium, short that you wouldn't be able to do with just a single off-taker for a project. So in that way, you could kind of both catalyse renewable energy investment, but also smooth out those energy prices at the other end.
Yiping, I'm curious about your perspective on this, because I think you mentioned a couple of interesting things that can be positive outcomes of inflation, one of them being some economic growth. Sometimes it can sort of help an economy to grow. Another thing is that it can maybe reveal how dependent we are on certain things we want to shift away from. What do you see happening in this moment? How do you see countries reacting to the inflation, to the energy prices, and I guess to also tariffs and some of the other issues that we've seen?
I think, as I said, even though inflation rates are picking up across the board, and energy was one main driver, or at least a trigger, you're seeing actually the consequences are quite different in different places. So for instance, in the US, you are seeing CPI picking up alongside the PPI, which means the higher cost is being transmitted to the end users of these products. Yeah. In China, that's less so, even though CPI also picked up a little bit, but the core inflation rate is quite stable. So that probably means in the US, consumers are bearing more of the cost of the rising energy cost. While in China, at the moment, they're probably squeezing, even though, as mentioned many times, the impact is more modest in China. We're probably seeing the squeeze on manufacturers' profit margins. That's something I think we need to...
So companies are eating more of the cost, whereas in the US, it's getting passed.
So overall, because we have a relatively weak domestic demand problem, that's why I think you look at the policy responses from the central banks and the government, they would be different. The Fed now is thinking about a hike sometimes in the rest of the year, at least one. ECB already did one. I think PBOC is not going to hike. PBOC is still thinking about easing, but they also worry about the higher inflation problem, so they're thinking about the more targeted measures to boost the economic activity.
I want to make sure that we are able to take a few questions. So if anybody has a question about inflation or anything for our guests, please raise your hand, and we've got microphones that will come around. Yes.
Hello, and thank you for your question. Thank you for your answers, and this panel has been amazing. The question asks, who pays for inflation? And I think I have the answer, me. I am a global shaper, and I am the chairman of Jamaica's Artificial Intelligence Association, and notoriously, I'm not an economist at all. But for my generation, inflation doesn't show up mainly in prices. It shows up in our actions. People have stopped having children, stopped buying homes, and I don't necessarily think this is by choice. It's just because the baseline has also moved. And here's what makes it worse. In a place like Jamaica, most of our inflation toolkit assumes monetary sovereignty, room to move rates, a currency that floats, and small import-dependent economies have neither. So the standard levers are almost theoretical for us. From your vantage point, what actually protects an economy like this and the young people inside it when the usual tools aren't actually available?
Well, if I still think the actions you mentioned, like not having lots of kids and so on, they are actually responses to high cost of living or education or anything. So I don't think these are forms of the result of inflation. They are responses to high cost we see. That's the first point I want to make. But I see your point, and I agree very much to what you just said. What the policymakers can do? The first thing is macroeconomic policies can only address like general issues. You can't address specifically the energy cost issue or even education issue. These probably need to be left to the specific policies. So we are all talking about the central bank monetary policy. They target at an average CPI or PPI rate. But that's important because if it keeps down the average rate, it means the overall cost of living would be still contained. The specific issue you mentioned certainly deserve specific policy actions. So for instance, if energy cost is really too high and people can't really survive because of this, the government should subsidize or should take whatever actions trying to stabilize the prices. These are mainly for the fiscal policies or income redistribution policies, not for monetary policies.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Ding Huang. I'm Nicole Chen from London Stock Exchange Group. I just want to follow up the last discussion about how policymakers can maintain the public trust when they manage the measurements on the inflation. So we are seeing that inflation has not just a test of monetary policy. It's more like a public test, especially when our central bank or government, policymaker, they're trying to push something to control the inflation, while maybe some measurements in short term, especially for those maybe lower income household or some SME business, it's going to be a short-term pain, right? So for those policymakers, what else they can do, to maintain the public trust, however, also achieve sort of the control the inflation problem?
I guess there are a couple of issues here. Number one, I'm not sure if you're hinting to that, is the reliability of the numbers we put together. I mean, there are always controversies about whether or not they accurately measure the number, but there are a large body of literature looking at consumers' feeling and the statistics. Sometimes they could be different. But I think overall, this agreement is more limited about the overall inflation or deflationary pressure in the economy. So that doesn't stop the central banks taking actions in stabilizing the inflation. That's my first point. The reliability or accuracy of the numbers can always be challenged because these are statistics. But the second point you mentioned is also very important, I think related to what I just mentioned earlier. When inflation rate rises, the impact on consumer groups or on industries differ. And we usually see when inflation rates rise rapidly, it hurts low-income household more than the high-income household. But that's not something central bank can deal with. And again, I think I will leave that to Ministry of Finance, the fiscal policy should try to take action to protect the low-income household, especially when the inflation rate becomes high.
Elizabeth and Karen, I'd love to get your reactions to this too, because you both spoke about affordability and the relative impact of rising prices on different people within an economy and their ability to afford things, or the ability of countries to afford things.
Yeah, I really love the Jamaica example because the Caribbean as a whole has this major dependency on imports of fuel for electricity generation. And it would make so much sense to have a system of electricity generation sharing, interconnectivity. Actually, I know some projects that are looking at building basically an electricity line from power plants in Florida to serve the Caribbean for this region. And when you're so dependent on things like tourism to earn foreign exchange, and the agricultural sector of the Caribbean's been decimated over 50, 60 years, focusing on things like tourism rather than domestic production. So these are fiscal policy choices, absolutely, but they have long-term consequences. And as we see volatility in energy markets, it just kind of double downs on the issue of regional cooperation, on accessibility of financing for these kind of shared projects. And certainly renewables would be also a great idea, but most of the power sector in the Caribbean is gas generation, or even much dirtier diesel fuel generation, which is a big, big problem. So anyway, I think small economies, island economies, have these very special requirements and difficulties that we could find solutions to. Like, there are capital solutions to these issues, but it's pretty challenging to draw enough attention to them.
And Elizabeth, I wonder if you can close us out. We're getting close to the end of our session, but I'd love your thoughts on either this issue or any final thoughts that you have.
Sure. Look, I think that asset price inflation has been so devastating for people in many jurisdictions, certainly in yours, certainly in Australia, where people just feel completely locked out now of the property market and just despairing at the thought of, where will I live? I won't have a family because of that. So governments really have to act with some urgency. This issue of politicisation, though, is really intense. Our government has recently introduced a very significant change to capital gains tax, which has reduced tax breaks for property investors, and that everyone was saying that something needed to be done, and the government did something, and now all investors are up in arms. Oh, wow, the prices of our assets are decreasing. So this is really challenging for governments, but I think the moment calls for bravery. And the question is, how do you communicate to the public these changes in ways that make sense? And also, how can we work to depoliticise some of these hugely, energy policy is so political. It's geopolitically charged, it's domestically charged by populist politics. And so, how do we build that social and political consensus? There are only two things that we can do. I think, or maybe there's more, but there's at least two things that we can do. One, we have to ensure this is an equitable transition, that people feel that they are seeing the benefit of the shift to renewables, that they are seeing the benefit. You can't just throw up wind farms and not, and have people, bear the kind of visual impact but not see the changes in prices. That's one. And the other is thinking about these potential institutional mechanisms to take those decisions out of the thrust and parry of partisan politics and put it in something like an independent energy reserve bank, so that just like central banks, the governments of the day can say, this is an independent decision.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank the World Economic Forum. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and please give a hand to our really wonderful panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.